Well, thank you for having me, and thank you particularly for planting all those trees. That really does make a difference, and as we get into this, I think, will see why it does make a big difference, and it's really an example of how we address some of the environmental issues we're facing. The other thing I want to say is thanks to Rotary internationally for being such a great supporter of clean water worldwide, and we are, I speak on behalf of a lot of other folks who are very appreciative of what you do in the water arena. So I'm going to try to very quickly go through a lot of things, and so I'm going to try to give you a little summary up front because I have been known to get bogged down along the way. If we have time at the end, I hope you'll ask questions. I love getting questions. I'm used to it being a lawyer. Most judges barely let me stand up before they start asking questions. A couple of points. I actually can't see the slide, which I didn't realize. The Catawba has some serious problems, and what I want to say is they're solvable problems. They're problems that have been around for a long time. At times they've been worse. They're pretty bad right now, but they're all solvable problems. I'm going to have to move because I do have to peek at what I'm saying here. One of the big issues that I'm going to deal with is conservation measures. That is one of our biggest issues coming up. Most people are not aware that we're running out of water. But again, it is a solvable problem. I like to point out, I like to sail. I have 5 children. We can be out on a sailboat for a week and use 120 gallons of water. Needless to say, in this area we're using a whole lot more water than that in the typical house every day, and I'll talk about that a little later. It's relatively easy to address some of these issues like flooding, but we've got to want to change some of these things. And individually, you can make a difference, and the trees are a great example of where you can make a difference and things that you can do. Now, just a little bit about our organization. We're often confused with the Catawba Lands Conservancy, and what I will say about that is we both have the same goal, clean water. Their tool is mainly protecting land to result in clean water. We have some other tools. We do education work, advocacy work, protection work. We have a lot of volunteers that we've trained that are out kind of doing what I say triage for regulators, trying to identify potential problems, identify the serious ones, and report them to the appropriate public officials. We do stream cleanups. I know some of you have places down on Lake Wylie or live down there. On Lake Wylie, in a typical year, we get out anywhere from about 1,000 people to 1,400 people on one day to do a cleanup on Lake Wylie. A few years ago, we took out 80 tons of trash from Lake Wylie in one day. So if you want to do another activity in addition to tree planting, always on the first Saturday of October every year, we have big cleanups on all the lakes and river segments in the area, also streams in Charlotte. We respond to reports of problems. There are lots of problems. I had a summer intern this summer try to count up all the reports that we had received of spills that were verified, and we got to over 700 for the first 6 months of the year. A couple of towns in this basin have had spills totaling over 1 million gallons in 2013. That's not unusual. So we respond, probably the most common problem we respond to is overflowing sewers. And there are a lot of them out there, and it's basically an infrastructure issue. As development picks up, another problem we get calls about is a lot of sediment showing up, in particularly lakes, from development projects. This was a development project down in Indian Trail. We also run a youth kayak program in the summer. We do this with the Boys and Girls Clubs. They're sponsored by the Salvation Army primarily. It is a great program. We get kids who are from just backgrounds where they would not ordinarily have the chance to go out kayaking on the Catawba River. Try to teach them a little bit about the river, a little bit about ecology, a little bit about water safety skills, and have a fun time out on the water, and hopefully they're going to develop a lifelong love for the water. And you may say, well, that's pretty ambitious for a couple of days. But we've really had some great success story. A youth that won the Youth of the Year award here in the state this past year actually mentioned the fact that one of the great things she got to do as a result of being in the Boys and Girls Clubs, and one of the things that motivated her was getting to go kayak with the Catawba Riverkeeper. Catawba River, some of you probably are not familiar with where it runs, so if you ever skied up at Sugar Mountain, the backside of Sugar Mountain's in the Catawba Basin. Most of Grandfather Mountain's in the Catawba Basin. A big part of Blowing Rock is in the Catawba Basin. Linville and the Linville River and Linville Gorge are in the Catawba Basin. If you're going up I-40 towards Asheville and you go up that steep hill, that's pretty much near the edge of the Catawba Basin down on the southern end, although actually there's a little piece of the Catawba Basin that wraps around and goes up towards Black Mountain. A lot of great spots in the basin. The lower end of the basin, the river actually changes names, becomes the Watery River, and it goes down southeast of Columbia, South Carolina, and ends in the Congaree Swamp, essentially. It is really some spectacular spots. I'm going to show you some pictures in a second, but why should you care? Well, one, we get our drinking water from it. Most people in this region, the Catawba River is their primary source of drinking water. In this area, it is pretty much our only source of drinking water. If we mess up the Catawba River, we have messed up our drinking water source. We're a lot different than a lot of cities, older cities in the Northeast that have many different reservoirs with multiple water sources. Where if you get one water source contaminated, it's not the end of the world. You can switch over to the other reservoirs. Here, we mess up the Catawba River, we're in serious trouble in Charlotte. It makes economic sense. When I was in private practice, it always surprises the environmentalists I work with to say, usually it was industry who was first concerned about water issues. I remember going to the governor of South Carolina and trying to get changes in the water flow in South Carolina because it was literally shutting down a chemical plant in South Carolina because we didn't have enough water and the water quality was going down and there wasn't sufficient water to meet the needs of the chemical plant. There is still a lot of industry in this area that depends on water, not to mention all the water-based recreational businesses and of course the real estate business that's based around the lakes. I'd also argue there's a moral imperative to take care of the water. Pretty much whatever religious faith you have, there's an obligation to be good stewards of God's creation, and particularly so in the Christian faith. And then I'd like to say it's good for the soul. I love taking youth, particularly, also adults, out into the natural world. And what's amazing to me, I always, with teenagers, like to put them on their back, make them sleep outdoors looking at the stars. You put them on their back, looking up at the sky at night, and invariably they're going to start thinking about really the important stuff and asking hard questions and having amazingly deep discussions, because when you're looking up at all those stars, you can't help but realize kind of your own insignificance compared to everything else. All right, so why are we concerned about the Catawba? Well, we've received a lot of dubious distinctions. We've been named the most endangered river in the United States, and various other distinctions. I won't go through them all here. I'll talk about some of them later, but they're not good awards to receive. So that's a concern. Not that they're not fixable, but at least people around the rest of the United States look at this region and they say, y'all are doing something wrong. There's something going wrong here. Now, just so I don't get too pessimistic, let me say, things might not be as bad as some believe, and you can't believe, I know we have some journalists here, you can't believe everything you read in the paper about the water. All right, first the pretty stuff. Waterfalls. We got over 40 waterfalls over 40 feet high. Some of them are amazingly close to the highway, and people don't even know they are. This is Catawba Falls. It's an easy 20-minute hike off of I-40 out of Old Fort. Beautiful spot. They're actually a series of 3 waterfalls in a row right here. and they're all fairly spectacular in their own way. On our website, we've got directions on how to get to most of these waterfalls. Places like Wilson Creek that probably many people have never heard of. Spectacular whitewater location. I gotta say, I love to kayak, I love to canoe. This is a place I don't go anymore. I bang my heads on rocks enough time that I'm not gonna do it anymore. Great spot that is kind of family friendly is Lansford Canal. I don't know how many of you ever been there. It's a historic spot. There used to be a canal system, believe it or not. You could get a boat from the ocean to Rock Hill, South Carolina in the early 1800s. This is at the kind of one of the remnants of that old canal system, but in addition, it's the largest collection of spider lilies in the world. They bloom basically during the month of May. They're spectacular. You can see them by walking on the old towpath beside the river, or you can go with us and you can kayak down. You may say, well, I'm not sure I can do kayaking. I've taken my 90-year-old father-in-law down in a canoe through these spider lilies. I've taken my 6-month-year-old daughter down through these spider lilies. It's not that difficult. Pretty much anybody can do it, and it is beautiful. All right, what are the issues? Water quantity, water quality, water security. Water quantity, pretty obvious what that means. The concerns are we're both running out of water, and at the same time, at times, we have too much water, flashy flows. When it rains, we get so much runoff, it's just causing lots of flooding. Water quality issues, they're from a whole variety of sources, but I'll characterize the biggest issue, and I am going to get to coal ash and the recent spill, but the reason I want to talk about some of these other things is to put it into context. Yes, coal ash is a big issue. But truthfully, there are bigger issues out there, and really, there's no one issue that's the dominant cause of the water problems we're having. It's a whole variety of things, each of them contribute, and the fact is we got to address them all if we're going to solve the problems. Water security is probably the part that doesn't make sense to you. This is the idea is we are very vulnerable. When the rest of the country looks at this region, they say, wait a second. You're 100% dependent on one river and 2 reservoirs for your water supply for a major metropolitan area? You're crazy. That's ridiculous. That is a big risk. We're very vulnerable. And we're vulnerable from some man-made reasons. We're vulnerable for a variety of other reasons, some of which are natural. I do want to make the point, we faced some of these issues before. Basically, in the early 1900s, things were starting to get mechanized. Farmers could start getting mechanized farm equipment, clear a lot more land than they used to be. Foresters could go out and cut down huge amounts of forest. And all of a sudden we started having these gigantic floods in this region because there weren't trees anymore to stop all that rainwater. This is the flood of 1916. It's still the flood of record in the Catawba Basin. That's basically where the town of Mount Holly is, one of the old textile mills, a before and after picture, just to show you the power of the Catawba River and what happens when you kind of mess with the natural way things work. This is what the farm fields and the forest places looked like back in the early 1900s. I would say we're repeating some of the old mistakes. We had big problems back in the early 1900s. Right before the Dust Bowl, we were the poster child for bad farm practices. But we addressed some of those. The problem is between now and then, even though we generally do things a whole lot better than we did then, we have a lot more people. And Mother Nature can't fix some of the problems that it used to be able to fix. Another example, this is Little Sugar Creek, basically the bridge where Moorhead Street crosses over it down by the hospital. Some of you may know what's going on in this picture. Anybody think they know what's happening in this picture? You know. Okay. Well, for the rest of you, the creek used to smell so bad from sewage, and I'm told it came primarily from the old slums that were right in this area where we are now. And there was raw sewage running down the streets into Little Sugar Creek. The creek smelled horrible, people complained, so they put barrels of orange blossom deodorant under the bridges to hide the smell. So we think we have sewage problems today. They were a whole lot worse. By the way, you look at this picture, you think, when was that picture taken? 1961.
Oh.
Not that long ago. All right, water quantity issues. This is a map showing what percentage of the water in a river basin is being used up, basically being consumed by people in that basin. In the West, it's not surprising. You have a bunch of river basins where there's a high percentage of the water being used. What's surprising is, where the arrow is, that's us. We have the highest percentage of water consumption of any basin east of the Mississippi. That's a concern because we're still growing like crazy and we're still using more water. Back in 2007, you remember we had a little drought. This is the Belmont water intake. That's a problem. As we continue to grow, as water demands continue to go up, are we going to run out of water? Now the good news is Duke and the towns are working together to try to address it. The bad news is, and I say this as an engineer, they're using an engineering solution. So yes, they're doing water conservation. The other thing they're doing is they're going about lowering the water intakes in the lakes. That means we probably won't run out of water, but you're going to see, if you're on a lake, you're going to see a lot more times when the lake is a lot lower than it used to be. What does that mean? That means if you live on a lake, you may be staring at a big muddy cove. What's that do to property values? It's going to have a big impact. We've looked at property values down at Lake Hartwell. They went through a long period where they didn't have water up to people's docks. Had a gigantic impact on property values. What's that do to tax bases? Has a gigantic impact. What's it do to marinas and businesses that depend on water? Has a big impact. This is just looking at property values. This is just on Lake Norman. We looked at tax values of property that are within a half mile of Lake Norman. In Lincoln County, almost 26% of the tax value of the entire county is right on Lake Norman. In Iredell County, it's almost 38%. Catawba County, it's almost 40%. You think, what happens if something happens, the level's lower in Lake Norman, where it affects the tax value of that property? We're talking billions of dollars worth of property. All right, the flip side of this, so I'll go from talking about drought to say, well, we have problems with flooding. This year was about flooding. Why? Well, an inch of rain in an acre of forest, virtually no runoff. An inch of rain on parking lot is about 26,000 gallons of runoff per inch of rain. That's a lot of runoff. A super Walmart, standard design, 18 acres of impervious area, parking lot and rooftop. That's a lot of runoff. 18 times however many inches of rain times 26,000 gallons that's going into the streams. That has a big impact on the streams. They fill up, causes a lot of erosion, essentially wipes out whatever natural life there is in that creek. And it's hard to sustain the ecosystem when you have these huge floods of water coming down the creek when it rains. Water quality issues. A lot of different issues, a lot of different causes. I would say most of them are due to what I'll call dumb growth. Growth is not a problem. We can deal with growth. It's doing it intelligently, and I'm going to show you some pictures of smart growth from the 1700s. That's really an example of how we should be doing growth. But let's look at the report card on our rivers. The state tests water quality. The state, if they were here, would probably be telling you only 16% of the segments in the Catawba Basin fail in North Carolina. That sounds great. The catch is this: they don't test every segment. So if you look at what percentage of the segments that they actually tested failed, 66% of the segments that they test the water quality fail to meet the water quality standards. If that's a test that my child is bringing home, that's a 34. Not too good a score. I'm not going to be too happy at my child. And if they say, but Dad, there are all these other parts that they didn't test me on that I'd have been perfect on, that excuse isn't going to go very far. I'm going to say that's what they tested you on. If you look at fish advisories, all water in the United States is supposed to meet its intended purposes. One of those purposes is fishing. So technically 100% of the water segments in the Catawba Basin fail to meet water quality standards because there is a fish advisory for every single segment of water in the Catawba Basin for mercury. In South Carolina, the score drops considerably. They get a 20. Why? It's pretty simple. They're downstream from Charlotte. Fish advisories are fish advisories for PCBs and mercury in the Catawba Basin. Pretty much everywhere we've tested for PCBs, we found high levels of PCBs in the fish. We're not sure where it's coming from. This is my daughter catching her first fish. Now, who wants to be the one to tell her you can't eat that fish because it will cause severe problems? And yet, the North Carolina State epidemiologist says about 13,677 children per year have lifelong learning disabilities as a result of eating fish with high mercury levels. This is a potent neurotoxin. All of us end up paying for all those children every year that have learning difficulties because they ate contaminated fish. And you say, well, who's eating it? What's amazing is, you know, since this is what I do, I'm always asking people about it. So I go get pine needles from a guy. He's Hispanic, and I asked him, I said, well, do you like to go fishing? I noticed you have a boat in your backyard. He says, oh yeah. I said, how often do you go fishing? Every day. How often do you bring fish home? Every day. What are you fishing for? Catfish. We know catfish are some of the most contaminated fish in the Catawba. How many children do you have? 8. So he's got 8 children that are eating catfish from the Catawba River several times a week. It's going to have an effect on those children. That isn't that unusual. I talk to fishermen up and down. You'd be surprised how many people are feeding their families from fish from the Catawba River. Development. Again, not all development's bad, but it can cause some big problems. This is up on Lake Norman. We don't have to do development this way. Basically, this development complied with the law. But unfortunately, they went ahead, they cleared every single tree on that property. There was no need to do that. They did comply with the law. They kept a buffer. They had sediment ponds, but it put feet of silt into that cove. If you lived in that cove, you used to have plenty of water to get your boat in pretty much any conditions. Now, when the water's low, you can't get a boat into that cove because it's full of sediment. That doesn't have to happen. We don't have to do development that way. Sewage. This is basically a failure of infrastructure to keep up with the growth in this region. We've done a great job in Mecklenburg County, not to say we don't have spills regularly, but they're small compared with the rest of the region. There are lots of towns in this region that simply have not maintained their infrastructure. Just to give you an example, Morganton, 2 spills in the last year, right around 1 million gallons each of raw sewage. That's not that unusual. Great Falls, if it rains, they have a spill. Tegakay, you probably saw in the paper. They've spilled something like 400,000+ gallons this year. These are very common problems. They're not hard to solve, but we've got to maintain our infrastructure to do it. Now, the other problem is where we don't extend our infrastructure and we allow growth without the infrastructure, we build private package treatment plants. That's what that lower picture is. It's basically what I call the mobile home of sewage treatment. It comes in on a flatbed truck, you lower it down with a crane, you hook it up. It doesn't have to have a human being there while it's operating. You know, you saw these recent dumping of PCBs into the Charlotte system. If that had happened at a package treatment plant, we would never know about it because there wouldn't have been a human being there to notice that there was something different going on at that plant. Every single package treatment plant we've ever tested has been failing. The design's okay, but it really takes human beings to operate them properly, and it's a failure to extend our infrastructure. It's basically allowing development in areas without adequate infrastructure that's causing these problems. Finally, this is kind of a startling thing. We have the highest density of septic tanks in the United States in the Catawba Basin. Again, it's the failure to extend our sewer systems and the allowing growth in areas where there aren't sewage systems, so people put in septic tanks. Guess what? Here's a shocker. Septic tanks don't work well in clay soil. Most of the septic tanks out there, particularly older septic tanks, are failing. We get a lot of complaints from people. They're saying, my grandkids are getting sick, my dog's getting sick, can you come out and test the water at our house? And I'll test the water down the lake. It's full of fecal coliform. We'll trace it back. Where's it coming from? It's coming from their own leaking septic tank. That's the most common problem we see, is leaking and failing septic tanks. All right, now I'm really going to go fast. All right, I promised you I'd talk about coal ash ponds, given the news. You've probably read about the coal ash pond failure in Dan River. North Carolina has the highest amount of high hazard coal ash ponds in the United States. So out of 45 high hazard coal ash ponds in the United States, turns out 4 of them are on the Catawba River, 12 of them are in North Carolina. Another kind of dubious distinction. Down in Lake Wylie, we have the Allen Steam Station, a massive series of coal ash ponds. Marshall Steam Station up on Lake Norman, even bigger. And this is Mountain Island Lake, where we get our drinking water. You say, well, they got permits, right? Well, when you look at the permits to see what are the limits for things like arsenic, selenium, mercury, what we're concerned about in coal ash, they have no limits. We also know that we have lots of seeps that are getting out into the water, which very high levels of things like arsenic in them, arsenic being a human carcinogen at very low levels, going right into our drinking water reservoir. These seeps, they've been characterized by some as being insignificant. In fact, some of these seeps are about 400,000 gallons per day. Pretty big numbers. In fact, by Duke's own internal documents, it indicates that for every 5 gallons that goes out for permitted discharge, they're losing 1 gallon other ways. That's what it looks like close up, where you see these seeps. And in some of the seeps, you can actually see the coal ash coming out of the ponds because it's such a direct conduit to the coal ash. Water security. So what happens when a coal ash pond fails? This is Tennessee in December 2008. You can see what it did to the river there. This is Lake Michigan, where a coal ash pond failed in 2011. This is the Dan River spill, which actually was a fairly small spill. It's affected 70 miles of river, and probably long-term damage for a long time could potentially basically destroy the ecosystem, because it's basically killing the basis of the ecosystem, the invertebrates down in the sediment. But that's a small spill. If you compare it to the coal ash ponds on the Catawba, our coal ash ponds are much bigger. Plus, it's our only source of drinking water. It would be a disaster if that happened here. There is a concern. There are concerns that some of the dikes are actually built on coal ash, which was the problem in Tennessee. We also know that when it floods, the flooding goes right up under the dikes, raising issues about the soundness of the foundation for the dikes. In Tennessee, they've spent almost $2 billion cleaning it up. River's still not clean. Can't use it for recreation. How'd you like to have a house on Lake Norman and have a little sign out there that says you can't use it for recreation or water skiing? So let me just end with something positive, if I could. Sure. We can fix these problems. And there are examples of where we've done it. One of them's right near here with the old, it used to be a parking lot for the Charlottetown Mall over Little Sugar Creek. That's what it looked like. It's much better today. Water quality is much better. These are fixable problems. That's one of the things I love it. Better development. Here's a model for good growth. Anybody know what town that is? Savannah, Georgia. If you go down to Savannah, the old town, parks with a water cistern in the middle. They collected all their rainwater, no runoff. It's actually a great plan for development today. I will end there.